Oh, you might want to stop the recording.
Oh, just because. Oh, because.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're gonna start in a minute, but I think we're okay. I'd just like to get on so that you know, I know it works.
Yeah, I usually wait until, but, you know,
Okay. Anyone? I know.
eventually
Sorry,
Mark will
future
beat
viewers.
this all out, I think. No, I'm having a very bad day.
Pardon?
I'm not having a good day, so,
I'm sorry.
yeah.
Hi, Myrna.
Hello.
How are
Hi,
you?
Lisa. Sorry you're not having a good day. And look at Kevin Teichman, how beautiful he is.
Hey, that's gorgeous.
I want to
Oh,
know what treatment he's getting to look that good.
who's that? Would
I
you
want to
say?
know what treatment he gets to look that good.
Yeah, we'll all line up at the doctors, right?
Yeah.
Hi,
Hi, Audrey.
Audrey.
Okay. Hello. I'm going to be on for a little while, and then I'm going to have to leave to go to a meeting, and then I'll come back.
Okay,
Okay.
we excuse you.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Rachel.
You have a note from your mother, Audrey?
What?
You have a note from your mother. I'm actually at my office. It's just, this is remarkable.
Oh my.
Wow.
What happened?
Yeah, I know. It's like I'm dusting everything off.
2 years
Office.
worth of
What's
dust.
that? I used to have one of those.
How does it feel to be back at the office?
It's okay. I'm only here for like an hour. I have bread rising at the house. I got to go back and knead my dough.
Oh my.
What are you making? What kind of dough? What kind of bread?
Sourdough
Oh,
with whole grain. It's pretty good, if I must say so.
your breads are usually pretty good. Well, at least the ones I've tasted.
Yes. Okay. I was just checking if I was
The time,
unmuted.
yeah. It
So I
is
think it's
noon.
time to begin. Yes. Welcome, everyone. Let's begin as we do each week. Just allow ourselves a deep breath to pause in the whirlwind of life here and say a blessing for the opportunity to study together, to connect our journey with the regular, steady unfolding of the weekly Torah teaching, and allow our perspective to broaden as a result of that. Join me, please. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Today, this week, Parashat Shalach Lecha. And I put in the message, and thank you so much, Debbie, for sending out reminders and keeping us all, you know, organized here. Um, I put the question, why so harsh? Which is always the question I have when I come to this parasha. I have a bunch of the actual parasha on our sheet today to look at together, and just to remind us of where we are. But just as a kind of an overview, this is the part of the book of Numbers where the scouts have been sent to look at the promised land, and they come back, and most of them come back to say it's kind of a scary place. I'm not sure we can pull this off. And the two, Caleb and Joshua, are the ones who try to say, actually, we can do this. It's going to be fine. And uh, as a result of that report and the excuse me, the community's reaction, the community is terrified by the report and start to kvetch and wail as they generally do during the Torah. God gets really angry and uh, brings down a rather harsh punishment, which is where my question always comes from. Why so harsh? But then there's a different part of the parasha. So this year we're in the third triennial portion, so I'm trying to focus us there as much as possible. And this is also the part of the Torah that brings up the vignette of the wood gatherer on Shabbat, who is, observed at his task, indicted, convicted, and at least according to the Torah, stoned to death for gathering wood on Shabbat. And again, to our modern eye, it just looks like, wow, really? So that's sort of where my question is going. So I'd like to start with you today by looking at that opening part, the part related to the spies, just to kind of warm us up, and then switch ahead to the vignette of the wood gatherer, which is where I'd like to focus our time together today. Okay, so here comes the, not there, hold on. Here's our source sheet. And our title for this week is Cruel and Unusual, as in cruel and unusual punishment. Just see if I can move this there. Okay, so first, here is the kind of the more famous part of the parasha. Just capturing this, I wasn't planning to read through all of this, but just kind of, I don't know if your eye can just kind of peruse through the moment when Caleb and Joshua have tried to soften or tried to kind of turn the negative report into something that is surmountable, something that is doable. But here we see God's reaction. And let's see, where can we start? That the current generation of Israelites is not even going to make it out of the wilderness. Notice in verse 32 here, you're going to live and die here in the wilderness because of your faithlessness. And then look at verse 34, which I've bolded here. But the Hebrew, I think, has a mistaken repeat in it here, if I'm reading it correctly. You shall bear your punishment for 40 years, corresponding to the number of days. In other words, the number of days of the scouting expedition. There's going to be a year of being stuck in the wilderness for every one of those days. Arba'im shana, 40 years. Vidatem et tnuati. And by this punishment, you'll really understand my conditions. That's how I would translate that. This is what I require, God is saying. I require faithfulness and obedience and compliance and not doubt and not complaining. Okay, and I'm just going to kind of go through this quickly. Those scouts that came back with it's always interesting to me that, like, let's look at verse 37 here. V'yamutu ha'anashim motziei dibat ha'aretz ra'a b'magefa lifnei Adonai. Those who spoke out against the possibility of entering the land, they died in a plague. That was their punishment. Also, wow, there's not a lot of gray here. It's you did this thing and out you go. Okay, so I really wanted to move ahead here now to later in the parasha, to chapter 15. And what comes right before this part that you're looking at now, is a discussion of personal responsibility and communal responsibility when there's been a transgression. And the Torah differentiates between a transgression that was intentional and a transgression that's a mistake. Okay, so here we're getting into what happens when someone has transgressed on purpose. And this is the response. Ve'anefesh asher ta'aseh beyad ramah min ha'ezrach u'min hager asher et Adonai hu megadef V'nichrata hanefesh hahi mikerav ha'ama. Nichrata, that person will be cut off. The noun form is karet, which is a form of execution, because in the wilderness, if you were cut off from the community, it would be pretty hard to survive at all. So it's not an immediate, assassination or execution, I guess is the better word. But the fact of being cut off is a form of a death sentence. Okay, so now let's skip ahead to our story, our wood carrier, verse 32. Vayiyu v'nei Yisrael b'midbar, they were in the wilderness, and we'll see that in the commentators, they're interested in just that little phrase. Okay, let's remember where we are. We're in the wilderness. Why are we in the wilderness? Why? Why are we stuck in the wilderness? Somebody jump in here.
Because the spies came back and said, you can't go in there. So God says they were there for 40 days. You're going to be here for 40 years.
40 years, correct. So we'll see in a minute, the commentators say, okay, there's something here. The reason that the Torah says the Israelites were in the wilderness, why bother saying that? It's to emphasize the point that they're still in a place of punishment with the stain of that bigger sin on the community still with them. Okay, so they're still walking around the wilderness. Vayimtzeu ish mikashesh etzim, and they find a man who is gathering wood bayom Shabbat, on the day of Shabbat. Vayakrivu oto hamotzim oto mikashesh etzim el Moshe, and they take him and they bring him to Moshe ve'el Aharon ve'el kol ha'edah. So they bring him forward to the leadership for judgment. I'm having trouble seeing today. Ve'yanichu oto b'mishmar ki lo parash ma ya'aseh lo. So they took him into custody because they weren't sure what should be the punishment for this wood gathering on Shabbat. And here it comes. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, mot yumat ha'ish. This is what will happen. God says to Moses, this man has to die. Ragumoto ba'avanim, kol ha'ada michutz lamachaneh. Take him and stone him to death outside of the camp. And this is the part that's on some level even more shocking. Verse 36, Vayotziu oto kol ha'edah. All the community took him el michutz lamachaneh, to outside the camp. Vayirgemu oto ba'avanim. And in fact, they stoned him with stones. Vayamot ka'asher tziva Adonai et Moshe. They killed him they made him die, just as God commanded to Moses. So a piece of you wants to say, wait a minute, if you could argue with God about going into the promised land, couldn't you argue about stoning a fellow citizen for gathering wood on Shabbat, or at least to our modern eyes? Those are some of the questions that start to come up. Okay, and then the last part of this parasha, somewhat enigmatically, goes from this episode of stoning to death into what will be familiar to you, I think, as the last paragraph of the Shema, what we know as the last paragraph of the Shema, which is also the end of Parashat Sholach Lecha. If you look at this, you'll go, oh yeah, I know this part. The commandment to put fringes on the corners of the garments and to attach a cord of blue. Asu lahem tzitzit al kanfei vigdehem ledorotam. Make a corner fringe for all your generations. V'natnu al tzitzit hakanaf patil techelet. Make that special blue thread as part of the tzitziot. V'haya lachem letzitzit. Then behold, here are your tzitziot. Uritem oto. Look at them. Uzachartem et kol mitzvot Adonai. And by looking at them, you will be reminded of, or you will remember all of the mitzvot of God. Va'asitem otam, and you will then do them. That's sort of the formula. You look, you remember, and then remembering, then you're supposed to also do. Velo tatur acharei levavchem ve'acharei einechem. And you won't get distracted. You won't go literally touring around, following the wanderings of your heart or the wanderings of your eyes, asher atem zonim achareihem, that you're naturally drawn to by all the distractions of being a human being. Okay, and then the rest, it's affirming this is the God who brought us out of Egypt. Okay, so my questions really relate to, wow, what is it about, first of all, Shabbat is so precious that you'd actually kill someone in order to preserve its importance for the community, which is interesting given where the rabbis land, many hundreds of years later with Shar HaMitzvot. Sorry, I'm getting myself confused here. That pikuach nefesh doche et shar hamitzvot. In order to save a life, you can transgress any mitzvah. So I guess the woodcutter wasn't saving anyone's life, so he wasn't allowed to break Shabbat. But who knows? Who knows what he was doing? We could write a whole midrash about it. Okay, let's see what a few other pieces to this. So this is now just going back to Exodus 31 to see where the Torah is clear about the death sentence for someone who breaks Shabbat. Okay, all the way back. I'm just going to look quickly with you at verse 14. Ushmartem et hashabat ki kodesh hi lachem mechalaleha mot yumat. There it is again, the death sentence. Ki kol haoseh ba melacha v'nichrata hanefesh hahi mikerav hameh. The punishment for breaking Shabbat is death, and death by karet. There's that word again. Can I get it to highlight? Nichrata is in the verb form, but if you just take those three letters inside, karet is to cut off, to banish, to separate someone from the community, which again, as we said, is in itself a kind of death sentence. Okay, so that's where the Torah law comes. And now here we are, many centuries in the future, in the Shulchan Aruch, probably the most foundational code of Jewish law, which I'm not sure we've had a quote from the Shulchan Aruch in all the months and a couple of years now of meeting on Wednesdays. So nice to be able to bring this into our study. So the Shulchan Aruch is now going to try to understand this or have something to say about it. What about kol melacha shechayevim alea b'Shabbat? All types of work for those transgressions a person is guilty on Shabbat and also on Yom Kippur, because Yom Kippur is known as Shabbat Shabbaton. It's the highest of all the Shabbatot, even if it doesn't fall on Shabbat. All types of work for whose transgression on the Shabbat a person is free from punishment but are still prohibited are also prohibited on Yom Kippur. And just going on here, also prohibited in a like manner, except that on Shabbat, a conscious sin is punishable by stoning. On Yom Kippur is punishable by karet. So I guess if you make this transgression on Yom Kippur, your punishment is a little bit less violent, but still deadly. Everything that is forbidden to be moved or handled on Shabbat is also forbidden to be moved or handled on Yom Kippur. So including, for instance, gathering wood because it's moving something or handling it. And then this is just, this is not really related to what we're talking about today, but just interesting to me to see as a little bit of, I don't know, just a little like Jewish sociological vignette here. The Shulchan Aruch goes to the extreme of specifying that, in fact, it's okay to clean vegetables and even to shell nuts, to open nuts from mincha time onwards, from the afternoon prayer service onwards, when Yom Kippur falls on a weekday. And the explanation comes to us that it was maybe a custom that children would be playing with nuts, and we wouldn't want to be holding them to these kinds of restrictions. They're allowed to be children, at least for a few minutes. Okay. Just continuing a little bit now with some more Torah commentary, but I put this in this order because, at least to the way I read it, the Orach Chaim is listening to the Shulchan Aruch and what he has to say here. So he's commenting back in our verses from Numbers 15. Remember I said before, while the Israelites were in the desert. I was looking for the specific quote here, but I'm not sure they offer it to us. So remember we said earlier, well, why does the Torah go to this extreme to say, oh, we're still in the desert, we're still wandering? The reason is that the Mekashesh Etzim, the wood gatherer, was guilty of violating Shabbat because at that time the desert was a proper public domain, and carrying it in for a distance of 4 cubits was more was forbidden on pain of death. So here he's saying part of the reason this was so harsh, so why the punishment is so extreme, is that it was in public. If he was in his own home or in his own tent, let's say, and moving a pile of wood, that's between him and God. But here in the public, that's significant. And just pause with me for a minute and let's talk about that. Public versus private transgressions. So it's probably obvious. I mean, there's lots of ways to think about this, but why do you think this comes up this way? Why is it so harsh in public and less so in private? Anybody who wants to just jump in here. Just don't forget to unmute. Go ahead, Myrna.
Well, I think they're trying to make a point for the public. I mean, for the community, and it is extreme, but it's also a very strong point. And I suspect that it gave people second thought to see someone punished publicly. But I'm also curious about when this was written, because it occurs to me that much of the harsh punishment was probably written during a time when there was a lot of transgression. And the scribes and the prophets were trying to get people back into the fold. And they saw the harsh punishment as a way of warning the community.
And corralling them.
Corralling them back.
Could easily be. I mean, we don't know exactly when these chapters were written, but certainly seems that there's a good chance they were written during the time of the prophets. The Torah doesn't want us to think that, but you probably know better.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Shlomo and then Michael.
Yeah. I think that this is happening while they're still at Sinai. And it's happening in the second year after coming out of Egypt. And so the laws have just been given. They're just organizing the people. They're just trying to set it up. And they need to make an example because, people aren't even familiar with these laws. And this may be the first. Well, no, I think there were also some people, this is interesting, come to think of it. There were some people that gathered manna on Shabbat at first. They weren't killed. They were told they would get double on Friday, but even though they were told that, there were still some who gathered on Shabbat.
Right.
And so that's kind of a conflict or something here, that they went out to gather manna on Shabbat and were not killed. Yeah. But here they're getting ready to move now. The tabernacle has been built. They've had their census, but they're still only in the very beginning of forming a people, of understanding what law is. And I think that, as Myrna is saying, an example, a public infraction like this, they have to make an example of it. The only other thing I want to add is, this is not only of great concern to us here, but the Talmud gives a story, an Agadah of
Mm.
God praying to himself that he would be more compassionate
Yes.
with his people.
Mhm.
And that might come right out of this. I'm not sure, but
Interesting.
yeah, that people were concerned even then, in the time of the Talmud, that God is not compassionate enough. And so
Yeah.
this story was written.
Yeah. Wonderful. Michael, hang on one second. I just wanted to, wow. I just had this whole scene playing in my head, Shlomo, and I've already lost it. Where were you before the piece about God being more compassionate? The thing you were saying right before that?
That the people, this was still at Sinai. They were just beginning to move,
Oh,
and it was
yeah. The scene that was going through my head was, um, you know, let's see, they're gathering manna on Shabbat, and that shouldn't be happening. And I'm imagining, Moses and God conferring together in the tent of meeting, and God saying, "We've got to do something about this," and Moses saying, "All right, let it go, it's okay." And then sort of this comes along, this wood gatherer, and God says, "Okay, we have to put this down right now. That we cannot go because we already can see things are kind of getting out of control. So let's send a clear, strong message now." Something like that. Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, on this issue of public versus private, I grew up Orthodox, and so the game was to bait the rabbi. So we're talking Shabbos, and we all say, "Well, fine, we can go on the main street and we can window shop. We don't go in. We keep our hands in our pockets and we window shop. That's Shabbosdik." I say, "You're not allowed to do that." Well, why not? Because somebody seeing you, it's in public,
Right.
would get the idea that it's okay. And they don't know that you didn't go in. And so this whole notion of how much more dangerous it is to get to the edge in public than it is in private flows throughout the entire laws that we follow.
Nachon. Thank you. So yeah, we can think about, you probably have heard the phrase ma'arit ayin, like the way a thing looks, the example of the way a thing looks is important in this realm of Jewish law, but also of Jewish community. Michael, listening to you, I was thinking about, I don't know if you all have had this kind of experience or have done this yourselves. Does anybody remember the Vegetable Garden, the restaurant, the vegetarian Chinese restaurant that opened? I think it's long gone, but when it first opened, it said it was purely vegetarian, and so if you kept kosher, it was like, oh, that could work because there's really not a lick of anything in that kitchen other than vegetable products. And my husband, who is, has always wished to be a mashgiach in his other life, I'm only partially kidding about that, was very excited. Like, okay, here's another restaurant. It's not officially hechshered, but there's no reason we couldn't eat there. And I remember that he was especially thrilled to find that at another table there was somebody sitting with a kippah on his head. And that meant, oh, well, this is like Michael's example. This is clearly fine because the more observant people are here and they are in the public realm eating here. So it's the positive example of this Marit Ayin. Go ahead, Marcia or Kevin.
I'm the defense lawyer for the person who's gathering the wood. And I want to make it clear this was a sin between God and the man. It had nothing to do with the whole congregation. And for God to expect the punishment to be dealt out by the congregation, that doesn't seem fair. God may not be as compassionate as we want. We modify the 13 attributes of God in our Haftorahs later from what they are initially. We understand that. But on Yom Kippur, we ask for sins between God and ourselves to be repealed or to be forgotten, and we still have to go to the individuals when we talk about the sins towards our fellow man. It doesn't seem right that this punishment was given to a person who perhaps even needed the wood to keep warm and save his life, and it could have been a Pekuach Nefesh instance as well. So I think there's reasonable doubt here.
Thank you, counselor. We will take your your appeal and bring it to the jury and come back with a decision for you. I wish we could do that. Bob, go ahead, and then we'll go back to our text.
This is a question that I've asked before. We don't stone people who work on Shabbat in our congregation.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean,
I know that a lot of the death penalties in the Torah were softened by the rabbis later on by adding so many requirements in order for it to happen that it would never actually happen. But if you're a Jew who is trying to be halakhically fundamentalist, and you're not doing this, you're not stoning people. I just wonder about, where the, our looking at it, we would say, no, there's some things here that we're just not going to do, even though they look like one of the, mitzvot. But someone who wants to be fundamentalist, how do they approach something like this, and how do they come to a decision about how to act? I mean, it makes me think that this type of passage is one of the reasons why some Jews will stone cars or throw stones at cars on Shabbat.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder about this, if I can be enlightened.
Anyone have an idea? I don't know the answer. I think it's a really good question, and I honestly never thought about this unfortunate behavior of, some in our community who are more observant, who are really observant, I guess, who feel that it's their place to indict others. Go ahead, BJ. It looks like you were going to say something.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just listening to a podcast that they were talking about this podcast called The Orthodox Conundrum. And the host was talking with, I think, Yossi Ben Halevi at Shalom Hartman.
Yossi Klein Halevi?
Yeah, Yossi Klein Halevi. So he was talking with him about Yom Yerushalayim. So the discussion about what's been going on, especially in East Jerusalem and these nationalist groups, and led to sort of a discussion about that, Bob, in terms of that unfortunately, not only in Judaism, but pretty much in any faith, that people can selectively go through texts and basically build proofs and sources that could justify them doing just about any kind of heinous act. And really what it boiled down to, I think what their discussion was, is that there needs to be more outcry from leadership. And there needs to be more taking responsibility in terms of, rabbis and community leaders and politicians, and well, at least in Israel, in terms of what is proper and what is not, and where those boundaries are. I mean, I remember several years ago, I was in DC at the Hadar Winter Seminar, and the theme of the whole program was going beyond the letter of the law. And I remember asking a very similar question to yours, and actually being sort of rebuffed, which I thought was a little curious. I won't get into the details, but I've had more time to kind of think about that. And it really, again, kind of gets back to, what are the fundamentals of your faith? If the fundamentals of your faith are kavod and chesed and rachamim, that's very different from what the principles of your faith basically being an obsession with minutia.
BJ, it makes me, think of the notion if Jews who feel themselves to be halachic do not follow all of these precepts, then we actually agree that not all the precepts should be followed, and we're not that different. We're just making decisions about what our modern life is going to be like and what our worship's going to be like. But it's not fair for someone to say, I'm halachic, they're halachic, and I'm not, if they're not also following, every single one of
Every
these
single one
commandments.
of these.
Yeah, I mean, it means we agree that it requires some interpretation and some choices.
Right. Right, before we apply. I was looking at BJ. It just happens BJ and Shlomo, you're on my screen, you're next to each other. And um, BJ, your comments made me think back to what Shlomo was saying before about what's the context in terms of the establishment of the community and the establishment of the law. And are there times where harsher punishment for noncompliance, let's not say stoning, but I don't know what, something else, is appropriate to help establish? But then once it's been established, is there more room for chesed and rachamim and etc.? And so, Shlomo's question or suggestion that since this is still very early on in the story of the journey and the relationship with the covenant is still embryonic, it's still a new thing that hasn't fully taken root, that not that we're trying to excuse the stoning to death or saying that we think that stoning is an appropriate response or even that death is an appropriate response, but that maybe there are different levels of harshness for different situations in time. Somehow I wanted to try to bring this back to the pandemic, which is one of the other things I was thinking about as I was pulling this together this week. And remember, at the beginning of the pandemic, especially, we in the United States, or at least some of us, were so interested in the divide between how our society was complying with pandemic protocols and how others were, working with that kind of compliance. When Jonathan and I were in Israel this past winter, we talked with people who were reminding us that at least in the first year, I guess, of the pandemic, the Israelis had people patrolling the streets to make sure that people were complying, to make sure that people weren't out beyond where they were supposed to be. Like, you were supposed to stay within a certain geographical area near your home. You weren't supposed to be unmasked. You weren't supposed to, blah, blah, blah. Like, they were really, really strict about ensuring that compliance. I guess they weren't stoning anyone if they didn't have their mask on, but something like that. Whereas here in the United States, as we all know, there was enormous amount of argument about personal freedom and personal free will and so on. So there's somehow a piece of that in this discussion as well. I'd like to go back to the source sheet because there's more to look at here. Let's see if I can pull it up. Yeah. Okay. So this was just a modern halachic interpreter. I really was mostly interested in this affirmation at the end, using this story to teach us how seriously the public desecrator of Shabbat damages the values of the nation and its faith. So again, like this notion that the public compliance is a particular issue different from personal compliance. Okay, now to try to explore what is the juxtaposition of these texts. Why do we hear about the wood carrier and the death penalty for the wood carrier next to the final paragraph about the tzitziot? Is there a chance that those two have something to do with each other? And here's what Nachmanides has to say. These two sections are placed near each other. Let's see. I think this means God, placed next to this section the subject of the man who gathered sticks on Shabbat, because it happened at this time, right after the incident of the spies. So that was why we looked at the spies first. And this is in accordance with the plain meaning of the scriptures. Remember, a few minutes ago, we were looking at how the Torah said, this this thing happened, and it happened while the children of Israel were still in the wilderness. And we talked about how the reason that the Torah even mentions that while they were still in the wilderness is because they sort of were still carrying around the echo of what had happened with the spies. That was still going on for them, still in their consciousness. Afterwards, God commands the precept of the tzitzit in order that they would remember through it all the commandments and not forget Shabbat, as apparently the man who gathered sticks had forgotten or decided to ignore, or any of the other commandments. Now, the reason why the tzitzit have this power of reminding one of all the commandments is, he's now going to quote Rashi, because the total numerical value of the letters of the word tzitzit is 600, and together with the 8 threads and 5 knots, you have 613. Corresponding to Taryag, as we call it, 613. And then he goes, I was going to skip over this. Nachmanides goes into a whole thing about the gematria of tzitzit and how it matches or doesn't match. But I'd like to skip down here. Let me just see. Oh, here. Okay, so let's go right to here. He says, I don't know, you can get lost in all this counting and the number of stitches and the knots and so on. He says, rather, the remembrance of the commandments, and therefore the observance of the commandments, is through the blue thread, which alludes to the all-inclusive attribute, which is bakol, in everything, which is the aim of all. And as the editor here has capitalized the letter A in all to suggests that it's connected to a sense of divine all. Therefore, he said, Uritem oto uzchartem et kol mitzvot Adonai. That's just what this English is saying. This is why the rabbis said, why was the blue chosen rather than any other color? Because blue resembles the sea resembles heaven resembles the throne of glory, etc. So the blue wrapped around our finger, if you happen to have the blue as part of your tzitziot, I know not everyone does, is meant to cue your awareness to a whole succession of images. Blue makes you think of the sea. The sea resembles heaven. Why? Because in the story of creation, the first thing is the separation between the upper blue and the lower blue to make the ocean and the heavens. And the heavens makes you think of the seat of God. The likeness is in the name, also in the shade of the color, which is the termination of all colors. The termination. Tachlit. We'll see that actually in the next commentary. We'll see the words tachlit and techelet, which somehow share a root, but one means the final color, and also the color blue. And anybody who was there on Shabbat, I was playing with the idea of the rainbow, the rainbow, the pride rainbow, and the colors of the rainbow. And I was saying there are 6 colors, and I heard a voice from the congregation say, no, there are 7 colors, and only realized later it was Jonathan calling out to correct me, to say there are 7, and the last color is this indigo, this what we call techelet, the dark blue kind of purpley color. Okay, so just I found it moving to see the way Nachmanides wants us to connect the difficult and enigmatic story of the wood gatherer. I'm saying it's enigmatic because we kind of want to scratch our heads and say, really, you're going to kill someone violently for transgressing Shabbat? And Nachmanides seems to be saying, but the parasha ends with this sort of calmer and more nourishing description of spiritual practice. And furthermore, that the mention of the techelet in the tzitziot is meant to connect you back to these central images of creation, which is to remember the central story of God's love for all of creation. So while you're puzzling over the murder of a citizen of the community for transgressing Shabbat, also hold on to your tzitzit and affirm the positive commandments. Shlomo, go ahead.
I want to go back to the Mikoshesh Eitzim, to the gatherer of the wood. And because I see a slight possibility that there might be something good coming out of this.
Okay.
About 30 years ago, George Dreesen and I went to Sinai. We took I don't know, 6 or 7 day something or other in Sinai with a group. And one of the things that I noticed in Sinai was low growing brambles all over the place. They're all over the place and they're thorny. But if you were going to gather wood, you would go out and gather these twigs of brambles because they just grow all over the place. What's the Hebrew word for a caper? I don't mean a bramble. I mean a caper.
Okay.
Low growing capers. What's the Hebrew word for caper? Salaf. And what's the Hebrew word for a sharp thorn? Chad. Salaf chad. A sharp caper. Now, what we have here with the Mikoshesh Eitzim is a sin that is mentioned, but not a name. There's no name mentioned as to who commits this sin. In a couple of Sedras in the future, we're going to come to a story of the daughters of Salafchad who committed a sin, but the sin is not, his name is given there, but the sin is not given there. You know, he did something and he died, and therefore, and what comes out of that, of course, is the right of women to have land. That whole story of the daughters of Tzalafchad leads to, as long as they marry within the tribe, they get to have ownership of land. And I'm not sure if anybody else wants to make the connection between this Mikoshesh Eitzim, but it's very interesting that Salaf Chad means a sharp caper, and that's what all the wood, much of the wood just laying around in the Sinai is capers. Anyhow, so I like to look at this. Well, maybe this was one of the first steps in granting women rights to legally own land.
That would be a very, very nice tikkun, if we could read it that way. Thank you for that. What a nice reframe. Bob, go ahead. Bob Barkin.
Yeah, it strikes me as an interesting contrast between two ways of enforcing discipline. One is the harshest possible, and basically fear, striking fear into, using this as an example to strike fear that you don't do it. The other one is with the talit, which is the reminder, the instruction, and actually you're surrounding, you're not only looking at the fringes, but you also, it's part of your talus. You're surrounding yourself, and it's a much more compassionate and I think effective way of teaching. You making the commandment much more compassionate than striking fear, and it also, there's all kind of this myth, and I know this drives Luther crazy, that the teacher is supposed to come in and be really harsh at the beginning of class, and then soften up later. And it's really kind of a myth. I think teaching pedagogy says that's not really what you need to do. That even enforcement is probably more effective, and you don't really need to trash people in order to maintain discipline. But I think it's the same thought that, that there's much more effective way of teaching and getting compliance than just coming down harsh and brutal.
I can't help but think, as you're telling this, I'm remembering when I was much younger and I was working at the Jewish day school, and we had a new principal at one point, and she said, you know the rule, don't smile for the first 2 weeks with your class. Don't let them see you smile. So I don't know, Bob, if you're doubting whether that technique is still used, but apparently at that time it really was. Okay, a couple of last things here. I think we'll probably end a little bit early today. I hope that's okay with everyone. This is just the Tur HaAroch, another less famous but still important new darshan. And just notice here what he has to say. He's building on Nachmanides' commentary that we just looked at about the presence of this tzitzit set of verses at the end of the parasha. He says, according to Nachmanides that we just read, the remembering of the Torah's commandments mentioned in our paragraph is due to the color of the thread of techelet, ocean blue wool, and not to any numerical values of the letters in the paragraph. Ocean blue, he says, reminds us of the blue sky, which in turn makes us think of the Creator presiding over his universe on his throne in heaven. So just seeing how this imagery gets sort of passed from one commentator to the next and is still part of our ritual when we're saying the Shema with those tzitziot wrapped around our finger. This last piece is from the Talmud, one of the places that directly references the story of the wood gatherer. And let's see what is being said here. It's relating also to the question of in public versus in private. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, Mekoshesh ma'avir arba amot birshut harabim hava. So again, when we read this, these excerpts from the Talmud, the bold part is the Talmudic text, and the unbolded part is the editor helping us fill in what's not obvious to us. So the wood gatherer who was sentenced to death for desecrating Shabbat was the one who carried 4 cubits. He carried a pile of wood for this far. Debbie, were you going to say something? Okay. He was stoned for performing the prohibited labor of carrying. And it was taught in a baraita, one of those extra teachings that doesn't always make it into the text. He was one who detached still growing branches. He was stoned for performing the prohibited labor of detaching. Rav Acha b'Rabbi Yaakov Amar me'amer hava. He was the one who gathered. So there's some arguing about, well, what is he being punished for? Is he being punished for detaching things that are still growing, which is one of the prohibitions, or is he being punished for gathering them into a pile? So this is more about just demonstrating the level to which those sages would go to try to understand, why was this guy why was he given the death sentence? Was it because of this transgression or that transgression? Seems worth trying to sort it out if it's truly a life and death penalty, which it is in this case. I'd like to bring this to a close by going back to the texts of the tzitzit here. And I want to just remind us of something that I'm pretty sure I mentioned this last year on Shalach Lecha. It's something that I learned. It's a commentary on this piece right here. Wait a minute. I'll bold it. Oh, come on. So this, again, will be, I think it'll be familiar to people that are used to going to shul. We would chant this according to its tropes. Velo taturu acharei levavchem ve'acharei nechem asher atem zonim achareihem. And this verb, velo taturu, latur in Hebrew is to wander, to travel, to explore, to go on tour. I mean, we could even use its cognate. I'm not sure it's an official cognate, but I'm suggesting that just by sound it is. Don't get lost. Don't follow those wanderings of your heart and your eyes, because they will take you to strange places. They will get you distracted from what you're here to do. And I think it was Sam Swire who in memory of his grandfather at the time of his Shiva, brought forth this teaching that connects this, velo taturu, this little phrase here, all the way back to the spies.
Yes.
Mr. Shlomo, you remember this, or maybe you knew this from elsewhere.
Well, it's the same verb.
Yes.
Yaturu ba'aretz.
Correct. Right. It's the same exact verb. And the suggestion, of course, is that that's what happened. The spies went exploring and kind of got lost in their own fears, their own anxieties, the wanderings of their own eyes and their own heart and mind, their own consciousness. And as a result, they really suffered. And so that's why this commentator says the parasha ends with this commandment, lo taturu. Don't get lost, which happens to all of us. We think we're at a certain task, and we enter the realm of our concerns, our fears. We're up at 3 a.m. worrying about how we're going to handle that hybrid Jewish identity class and make the computer work with the text in front of us, and then we're up for several hours worrying about it. So if it's possible to discipline ourselves to do, sorry, I just got a weird window pop up, to discipline ourselves to, I'm using that word discipline, to practice those mindfulness practices that we have and remind ourselves that we have the ability to direct our thoughts. We can choose to focus on the tzitziot and thereby focus on the techelet, the blue, and all of what the blue reminds us of, or we can choose to get lost in those fears.
That says something about Kalev and Yehoshua, though, because they came back and weren't sidetracked by their own anxieties and thoughts.
Correct. Which is why we hold them up as our heroes. Go ahead, Audrey.
Well, just real briefly, I'm sorry that I missed part of it, but the instruction for the scouts, not spies, was to bring back information. So they were off task immediately when they came back with their own impressions and got lost in their own fears and all of that. So they didn't kind of follow the instructions from the very beginning, which was, as a scout, you bring back facts, you bring back that kind of thing.
You mean if they just had come back and without sort of dispassionately said, yeah, there are some people living there, they're taller than we are, and
right, information, not their opinions about it, and not kind of all this fantasy stuff about things, but stuck to the task at hand, which is a way of dealing with anxiety too. Don't think about all the worst things that could happen. What is right in front of you? What can you see? What can you do? And move from there. So. And by the way, last night the tech was perfect.
Yeah, but I have more gray hair this morning as a result, as if that were possible. Michael, go ahead, and then we'll wrap up.
So this is going to leave the world open. We've connected the beginning of the parsha with the end of the parsha very nicely, and how they work together. So who or why or what's the discussion of why they stuck 2 sentences in about a guy collecting wood and violating the Shabbos. And then if you take it literally, this whole thing happened on Shabbos. So I guess murder is okay on Shabbos. And the whole thing just goes downhill from there. And it's stuck in like it didn't fit elsewhere. So it got stuck in there. It doesn't make sense why it's there.
Well, I mean, I don't think we have if you're looking to me to solve that conundrum, I'm not sure I can. In fact, I'm pretty sure I can't. But we can see the effort made by these generations of commentators to try to answer that same question.
Well, put it up again for next year when we come around to this section.
Next year when we come around to this section? Next year
we'll come around to this parsha next year.
We'll be at the beginning again next year.
It doesn't matter. It's in the parsha somewhere.
Yeah.
And we'll worry about it then.
Sorry, someone's ringing the doorbell, and I don't know if... I just wanted to end with one thought, which is... I'm sorry. one thought, which is that when you get into Deuteronomy and you meet the story of the Ben Sorero More, the child, the wayward child, who it says the commandment is to stone that child. The parents should take him and stone him, but it doesn't actually happen in the Torah. It doesn't say they took the child and they stoned him. And over the generations, at least the commentaries that I've seen have said, nobody stoned a child. Like, it was meant as a deterrent. It was meant as a way to try to convince young people to be respectful of their elders, of their parents, and so on. And I wish the same for this, that this could be, even though it does say that the community took him and stoned him, a piece of me wants to say, oh, somebody added that in. Nobody stoned a man for collecting wood on Shabbat. No reasonable person would do that. So that's the Torah that I'm holding on to. And with that, I need to go answer the doorbell because apparently no one else is here to do that. So thank you all. Thank you, Debbie. Have a good rest of the week and see you on Shabbat.